Hello, everybody. Welcome to U.S. History. Today we're going to be talking about spies and fears of communism in the United States, especially during the late 1940s and early 1950s. It's a very interesting time period. We're going to be talking about how perceptions of this time have changed with new evidence and new things that we've learned about history. Here's the big question I want to ask us today, and it's, was the fear of communists in the government justified, or was it hysteria? Now, the reason I have this particular image, this is from a popular play that was produced at this time called The Crucible by a guy named Arthur Miller. And this was written in 1953 at the height of what we would call the Red Scare. Remember, we talked about a Red Scare already that happened in the earlier part of the century, in 1919, right after World War I. This is the second Red Scare, the one that happens after World War II, where it's a much bigger deal because this really dominates politics at the time, and a lot of the political discourse was who is a secret communist, who is a sympathetic to the communists. And this is going to be a big deal, especially when it comes to when people in Hollywood and in the arts in general start to be accused of being communists. Now, there's kind of this idea that what happened during this time was a witch hunt, a literal witch hunt, which is what this play I have down here was all about. It was basically saying that the Salem witch trials was a perfect allegory to what was happening in the 1950s. Now, I'm not so sure that's the case, but it's interesting to think about nonetheless. So while, of course, in the Salem witch trials, there weren't really witches going around cursing people, there really were communists in the government. So we're going to be talking about the response to that and if it was justified or not. Or was it all just a bunch of hysteria? Let's try to answer that question. First, the loyalty program. This is kind of the first, this was the first strike against communists in the government. So Truman was fearful of Soviet spies. The Soviet Union had one of the best spying programs in the entire world at this time. In fact, they probably had the best spying network available. Of course, Stalin was very paranoid. So to avert, the idea of people rising up against him, he developed this very good spy network, and this would become a constant issue, especially once he turned his attention to the United States as opposed to his old enemy, the Nazis. So Truman was very fearful of Soviet spies being in the United States government, and he had good reason to. All new employees hired by the federal government were to be investigated, and the FBI checked out their current employees. Those accused of either being communists or being communist sympathizers were brought before a loyalty review board, something like in the picture here, where they would question you and say, are you loyal to the United States of America? Do you oppose communism? Do you support communism? And basically they'd grill you on this until you were found out to be innocent or not. But it was very, it was a lot of pressure if you were put under one of these trials, as it were. Remember that the FBI is a domestic security service that was founded in 1908, and the CIA is somewhat newer. In 1947 is when it gets fully established, during this time of Cold War paranoia, where we don't know, who around us is a communist, who actually is against communism. This is going to be a big deal. And even the federal government steps in and creates the CIA. It doesn't have a law enforcement function. It's mostly focused on overseas intelligence gathering. And this would be, the spy organization of the United States. Doesn't start until 1947. But you can see the fact that they established it as something separate from the FBI means that they took this stuff very seriously. And this is really the golden age of, a spy versus spy sort of deal, where this is the time during the Cold War. We're trying to figure out their secrets, they're trying to figure out our secrets. There's a lot of espionage going on all across the world, and this will lead to a lot of thrilling things like spy books and spy movies and that sort of thing. This is the golden age of spying. What was the HUAC, or the HUAC? That's the House Un-American Activities Committee. It investigated disloyalty during and after World War II. There were lots of fears of communism, especially during this time, because the Chinese communists actually had won their civil war in 1949, and there was fears of other countries falling to similar communist takeovers of the country. So there's a fear in America that there were people working in the government to take down America from the inside, and this was a huge fear, so people took it really seriously. Here's one of the ways that communists or people who had ties to the communists were actually kind of rooted out. And this was a famous incident involving people called the Hollywood 10. They were a group of writers, directors, and actors who had ties to the U.S. Communist Party in the 1940s. Before the end of World War II, the Communist Party had existed in America for over 30 years at that point. It included a lot of people involved in Hollywood and the arts and that sort of thing. It was popular to be part of the Communist Party of America. But after we had kind of formally made the Soviet Union our main rival on the world stage, people who had previous ties to communism at all were very much seen with a lot of suspicion. They were actually, the Hollywood 10 here, were held in contempt of Congress for refusing to answer questions for this House Un-American Activities Commission. So because they decided not to speak at all, they decided to not answer questions about their ties to communism at all. Well, what happened to them was a lot of them had to serve actual prison time, 6 months to a year for many of them. And a lot of them were blacklisted upon not escaping from prison, but ending their time in prison. So sometimes being seen as a communist really was a death sentence to your career. So that's how things were pretty scary during this time. There were also a lot of people who were tried successfully for spying, because there definitely were spies in the US government, and there were people, even in Hollywood, who were in talks with the Soviet Union during this time. So there's a lot of times where that whole idea of it being a witch hunt isn't quite correct, because there definitely were some people who were in contact with the Soviet Union at the time. But the problem is that the response to it went way over the line and definitely went against people's constitutional rights. The whole idea that is spelled out in the Constitution, of course, that you don't have to testify against yourself, that you can plead the Fifth Amendment, and also the fact that you are innocent until proven guilty. A lot of cases during this time, it felt like the opposite, that people were accused and they were guilty until they could prove their innocence, which is against what the American justice system is supposed to be like. This was one of the most famous cases during the Cold War, was the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were sentenced to death for violating the Espionage Act by passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, this has continued to be a big controversy in American history, if the Rosenbergs both deserved to be executed for their crimes. What we found is that Julius Rosenberg definitely was guilty of passing these secrets to the Soviet Union, but his wife Ethel, well, that's a little bit more murky in terms of how much she actually knew about what her husband was up to. So the fact that both of them were executed for selling secrets to the Soviet Union is still controversial to this day. Especially with, it's like, is it ethical to execute people for their crimes in the first place, especially for something like spying, and, was Ethel involved in this at all? So, at the time, a lot of the people investigating them said that she was, and it's definitely with evidence that's come out in the since, Julius was definitely guilty. But was his wife, it's still harder to really know for sure. Now we had another person who was accused, another famous case of someone in the State Department, a man named Alger Hiss. We'll actually be watching a video about him later, about kind of his presumed innocence or presumed guilt, and what we found out since then. We're going to be doing an actual lesson on his whole case, because it's very interesting, especially with what we've learned since the fall of the Soviet Union, when a lot of these documents have been released about who the Soviet Union really was in contact with during this time. Now, the most famous example of this is McCarthyism and what was going on with Senator Joseph McCarthy. Now, a lot of times the Red Scare and what happened with the House Un-American Activities Commission and McCarthyism and what happened with the Hollywood 10, sometimes they get mixed in together. And that's not exactly the case with what was going on with Joseph McCarthy. Remember, well, I haven't told you yet, but Joseph McCarthy is a senator, so he was in the Senate, and this happened after the House Commission earlier in 1948. This happens 2 years later. Now, McCarthy was a very gun-ho anti-communist, and he accused many people in the State Department specifically of being communists or being communist sympathizers or outright spies. And what Joseph McCarthy did was that he actually had a list of people who he believed to be communists, and he said he had a list of 52 people, and basically he was able to play up the media into covering his trials and this list that he had, because basically if you were on this list and he outed you, you know, there would be such a wave of media speculation and people not trusting you. It would basically be a career ender, even if the evidence wasn't all the way there. He even took it to the floor of the Senate. So for many years, McCarthy was a very famous individual in the American news, especially because he had this list, and if he said, I'm going to release the names of people on the list, well, that would be the #1 news story that day. So this is how Joseph McCarthy went from a senator who was somewhat known to being one of the most famous people in America. Eventually, he accused people in the army of being communist sympathizers as well, and this is where a lot of its tactics went too far. He really didn't have the evidence he had for some of the other people that he accused. This is really kind of where he was, I think, probably on the height of his power, and he thought he could probably get away with a lot of these accusations and kind of bully people into agreeing with him, but it simply kind of fell apart once he started accusing people in the army. He was actually censured by the Senate, and that means basically the Senate voted to say, hey, we think you have gone too far, and we can't remove you from office because he was elected, but they can say we denounce your activities that you've been doing. And once he did that, it took away a lot of his power, and people stopped following a lot of his trials and a lot of his accusations, and it didn't take much longer before he was kind of forgotten about entirely. But let's talk about McCarthyism in maybe a different light, because there was the idea that this was a total witch hunt and that he had no evidence and no proof. But, even your book might say that. But I think there was something there, but he made some key, very bad mistakes. So we'll talk about that. So this is from an American diplomat at the time named George Kennan. He had a very interesting quote. Here it is. The penetration of the American governmental services by members or agents, conscious or otherwise, of the American Communist Party in the late 1930s was not a figment of the imagination. It really existed, and it assumed proportions which, while never overwhelming, were also not trivial. So, not trivial, but not overwhelming. So there was something there. However, the response to it and the paranoia that many people thought about it was probably overboard, and definitely, unfortunately, ruined a lot of people's careers and reputations unnecessarily. That's the main thing. But there was an element there. It wasn't a complete witch hunt, which people were trying to root out where there was nothing there. There was something here, but the response was so over the top that it really made it not worth it. Here's how another historian talked about this time. This was a bitterly partisan era. Interestingly enough, we're also going through a very partisan era, and this was also between Democrats and Republicans. This was a bitterly partisan era. Emotions ran very, very high about how to conduct the Cold War. about how to deal with the threat of Stalinism, both abroad but also at home. You had American soldiers dying in Korea. The Korean War forms the vivid backdrop for all of McCarthy's career. There was a bitter partisan battle here in which the people were prepared to say almost anything to blacken their reputations and to smear their political opponents. McCarthy did it, his Republican allies did it. You also have to remember that Democrats were quite prepared to do the same thing, and often did against McCarthy, calling him a Nazi sympathizer, talking about his investigations as posing a threat to American democracy and so on, charges which really don't hold up in light of historical evidence. So that was a longer quote there just to show that during this time we can understand a lot of Joseph McCarthy's actions a lot more if we understand the time period in which he was in. That this was something that pretty common, that during the Korean War, which we'll talk about next time, during kind of this backdrop, there's a lot of disagreements of how to run the Cold War and how to actually contain communism. And that's kind of the background behind everything. So during this partisan time, I believe that McCarthy probably used his position influence to kind of smear his opponents and try to take them down so they would have, so the Republican Party would probably have a better chance of running the country. But in conclusion, though, spies were in the government. This was not a completely made up scenario. There were spies in the government, and we found even more evidence of who they were since the fall of the Soviet Union. We've been able to find out that there were also spies that we had no idea about who had worked for many years as spies and informed the Soviet Union on a lot of activities that the Americans were doing that were supposed to be top secret. McCarthy really did use his position, though, to grab power and silence critics in an undemocratic way. And this also goes back to what I was talking about before, the presumption of guilt before innocence, which is a big problem, of course. Many innocent people who had left-of-center views were labeled as communist sympathizers. Just because people had more liberal viewpoints does not mean that they were pro-communist or pro-Soviet Union. And this was really the biggest problem during the time, is that anybody who had any sort of views that might have been left of center might have been seen as a communist sympathizer, and it really led to a lot of problems. So that's this era, somewhat in a nutshell. People not trusting each other, the fear of communism everywhere, really kind of neighbors who used to be friends. It's all of a sudden, it's like you can never be too sure, maybe they can be a secret communist. So a lot of this Cold War paranoia, this is really where it really gets to go to a fever pitch. And this is in the middle of the 1950s. Sometimes people kind of characterize the 1950s as this ideal time in American history, and I don't think that's really true, especially if you go back to some of the things that were happening, such as, the fears of communist takeover, and the fears of atomic war, and the Korean War, and all these problems we were having at the time. It really was a tumultuous decade, just like many of the other decades since. Not as much as the 1940s or as the 1960s, but it's kind of seen as this ideal time in American history, and I think that's not exactly true. Every time period has its own problems to some extent, some more obvious than others, and some kind of get swept under the rug of history. But it's important to remember the time period in which people operate and how that influences the decisions that they make. So thank you guys for joining. Next time we'll be talking about the Korean War in general, one of the more forgotten wars in American history, but it really had a large impact on the American psyche and even some of the things that are going on today in the world, especially when it comes to the Korean Peninsula. It'll also describe the United States, their ideas about containment and containing communism, which will become very, very important when we find ourselves in the Vietnam War in the next decade. So thank you guys for joining me. Bye-bye.